Relish Tray. Born in Wisconsin supper clubs in the 1930s when cocktail hour was sacred and guests needed something to nibble while nursing their old fashions. The genius was in the simplicity: raw vegetables and pickled items arranged on a divided glass dish that arrived at every table automatically, no ordering required. The classic setup was dill pickle spears, green olives stuffed with pimento, radishes carved into roses, celery sticks, and sometimes carrot sticks. The vegetables had to be ice cold, sitting in ice water in the walk-in until service, so they'd be crisp and refreshing. The pickles weren't homemade, they came from industrial-sized jars, the kind that sat in restaurant supply closets. The olives were always the cheap stuffed kind, salty and firm with that distinctive canned taste. Traditionalists insist the radish roses must be hand-carved by prep cooks each afternoon, cutting petals into the radish skin and soaking them in ice water so the petals would bloom outward. It was served in those segmented relish dishes, usually glass or crystal, placed at the table before drinks even arrived. Some clubs added pickled beets, cauliflower, or pearl onions depending on what was in season. The tray sat on the table throughout the meal, and you were expected to graze on it between courses. The vegetables were mostly ignored, but the pickles and olives disappeared quickly, their salt and brine perfect alongside cocktails. Grissini Breadsticks. These Italian breadsticks became supper club staples in the 1950s when clubs wanted to add European flair without straying too far from American comfort. Grissini arrived at the table in tall glasses or ceramic crocks, standing upright like edible centerpieces. The classic supper club version wasn't authentic Italian. They were thicker, shorter, and softer than traditional Turin Grissini. The dough was basic bread dough rolled into pencil-thin ropes, brushed with melted butter, and sprinkled with coarse salt, garlic powder, or sesame seeds. They baked until golden and crispy on the outside, but stayed slightly soft in the center, not the snap-in-half crispy that real Grissini had. Some clubs added Parmesan cheese to the butter, creating a richer, more savory coating. The breadsticks were made in bulk. Prep cooks would roll hundreds in the afternoon, arranging them on sheet pans and baking them in batches. They had to be thin enough to be elegant, but thick enough to survive sitting on tables for an hour without getting stale. The presentation was part of the appeal, standing upright in a glass so you could grab one without touching the others, seeing their golden, seed-studded surfaces. They were meant for grazing during cocktail hour, something to nibble with your Manhattan or gimlet while deciding what to order. The butter and salt made them addictive, and they were intentionally undersized so you'd eat 3 or 4 without feeling full before dinner arrived. Some clubs wrapped them in prosciutto for an upcharge appetizer, but the plain version was always free at the table, refilled throughout the meal. The garlic butter ones left your fingers slightly greasy, and the salt crystals provided satisfying crunch. They were sophisticated enough to feel European, but familiar enough to not intimidate Midwestern diners who'd never been to Italy. Popovers. These originated in American restaurants in the late 1800s, but became supper club signatures in the 1940s when clubs needed an impressive bread service that was cheap to make. The locals argue about which supper club perfected the technique first, but the Wisconsin and Minnesota clubs all claim ownership. The classic supper club popover uses a simple batter: eggs, milk, flour, and salt, beaten until smooth but not overworked. They weren't yeasted. The rise came purely from steam created by the eggs and milk hitting a screaming hot pan. The batter got poured into specialized popover pans or muffin tins that had been preheated with butter, so the batter would start cooking immediately. They baked at high heat until they puffed dramatically, the outside turning golden brown and crispy, while the inside stayed hollow and custardy. Some clubs added butter, others used beef drippings for richer flavor. Either way, the contrast between the crispy, almost burnt exterior and the soft, eggy interior is what made them work. They were rushed to tables straight from the oven, still puffing and steaming, served in cloth-lined baskets to keep them warm. The timing was crucial. They had to hit the table while still hot because they'd deflate and get chewy within minutes. Guests would tear them open, the steam escaping, and slather them with whipped butter or strawberry butter that many clubs served. The hollow interior was perfect for holding melted butter, and the eggy flavor was rich enough to stand up to a strong cocktail. French onion soup. This French bistro classic became a supper club staple in the 1950s when American diners started craving European sophistication. French onion soup was all about slow-cooking onions in butter until they caramelized and turned sweet and dark. Traditional supper club versions started with yellow onions, sliced thin and cooked low and slow for at least an hour, sometimes two. The onions had to turn deep golden brown, almost mahogany, releasing their sugars and becoming intensely sweet. Beef stock was the liquid base, though some clubs used a combination of beef and chicken. The stock had to be rich and dark, and many clubs made their own, simmering beef bones for hours. A splash of dry sherry or brandy went in near the end, adding complexity. The soup was ladled into individual oven-safe crocks, topped with a thick slice of toasted French bread, then covered completely with shredded Gruyere or Swiss cheese. Some clubs used a mix of cheeses, Gruyere for flavor, mozzarella for stretch. The crocks went under the broiler until the cheese melted, bubbled, and turned golden brown with dark spots. The cheese had to form a seal over the crock, trapping the soup underneath. When it arrived at the table, the cheese was molten and stretchy. Breaking through that cheese lid released steam and the smell of caramelized onions and beef broth. The onions underneath were silky and sweet, the broth rich and beefy, and the bread soaked up liquid while providing texture. Eating it required a spoon and knife, cutting through the cheese, then spooning up onions and broth-soaked bread. Kiddie Cocktail. The name literally means children's cocktail, and this mocktail comes from supper clubs in the 1950s when families dined together and kids wanted to feel included in cocktail hour. Kiddie cocktails are all about making children feel sophisticated while keeping it completely non-alcoholic. The classic version used Sprite or 7-Up as the base, though some clubs used ginger ale or lemon-lime soda. Grenadine syrup, that bright red sweet syrup made from pomegranate, got added, turning the clear soda pink or red. The ratio varied by bartender, but usually it was about an ounce of grenadine to 6 ounces of soda. The drink had to be served in a proper cocktail glass or rocks glass, not a kid's cup, because the whole point was making children feel grown up. A maraschino cherry went in, always the bright red kind with the stem still attached, so kids could hold it by the stem and eat it like their parents ate olives from martinis. Some bartenders added multiple cherries, others added orange slices. The most elaborate versions came with both cherries and orange wheels, plus a cocktail sword for spearing the fruit. It was poured over ice, making it cold and fizzy. The grenadine settled at the bottom initially, creating a gradient effect from red to pink to clear, though stirring mixed it into uniform pink. The taste was pure sugar, sweet soda with sweeter syrup, and that distinctive artificial cherry flavor from the garnish. Kids would nurse them slowly, mimicking their parents' cocktail-sipping behavior, and bartenders treated the orders seriously, making them with the same care as adult drinks. In supper club culture, everyone got a proper drink, regardless of age. Cottage cheese with pineapple and cherry. This combination started appearing on supper club menus in the 1960s when cottage cheese was marketed as a health food and diet staple. Cottage cheese with fruit wasn't a salad. It was served as an appetizer or side dish, positioned between the relish tray and the main course. The cottage cheese had to be full fat, the large curd kind with visible lumps, not the smooth, low-fat versions. It was scooped onto a chilled plate or into a small bowl using an ice cream scoop, creating a perfect round mound. The pineapple came from cans, either a pineapple ring placed around the cottage cheese mound or pineapple chunks arranged beside it. Fresh pineapple was too expensive and inconsistent. Canned pineapple rings were uniform, reliably sweet, and came in those huge restaurant-sized cans. The maraschino cherry was the crown, one bright red cherry placed precisely on top of the cottage cheese mound. Some clubs used 2 cherries. The most elaborate presentations included a lettuce leaf underneath, making it look like a proper composed salad. The cottage cheese was cold and creamy, with tangy flavor from the cultured dairy. The curds provided texture, lumpy and slightly squeaky when you chewed them. The pineapple added sweetness and tropical flavor, its juice mixing with the cottage cheese's liquid. The cherry was pure decoration, that artificial maraschino flavor providing a final sweet note. This was served as a palate cleanser or light start, especially popular with women ordering steaks. The cottage cheese suggesting they were being health conscious even while ordering prime rib. The combination seems bizarre now, but in supper club culture, it was sophisticated. The presentation mattered as much as the taste, that perfect scoop, the centered cherry, the visual appeal of white cheese with bright fruit. Au Gratin Potatoes. Supper Club Au Gratin Potatoes came in 2 forms, and which version your favorite club served defined your loyalty. The classic version used thinly sliced potatoes layered in a baking dish with cream, butter, and cheese, then baked until tender with a golden bubbling top. The potatoes had to be sliced paper thin, usually with a mandolin, so they'd cook evenly and layer properly. Russet potatoes were standard because they had enough starch to thicken the cream naturally. The cream wasn't just milk, it was heavy cream, sometimes mixed with whole milk to prevent it from being too rich, but always cream-based. Sharp cheddar was the traditional cheese, shredded and layered between potato slices. Some clubs mixed in Gruyere or Parmesan for complexity. Each layer was seasoned with salt, white pepper, and sometimes a pinch of nutmeg. The potatoes went into hotel pans, layer after layer, cream poured over to almost cover them, cheese sprinkled throughout and heavily on top. They baked for over an hour at moderate temperature until the potatoes were fork tender. The cream had thickened from the potato starch, and the top was golden brown with crispy, cheese-crusted edges. The other version was faster, parboiled potato slices tossed in a cheese sauce made from a roux, then baked just long enough to brown the top. Both versions arrived at the table in the same hotel pan they baked in, the edges bubbling, the top crispy and golden. Servers would scoop portions directly onto dinner plates, the cream sauce pooling around the potatoes. Each bite had tender potato that had absorbed cream and cheese, with those crispy edges providing textural contrast. The richness was intentional. This wasn't a light-side dish, it was indulgent and luxurious, matching the supper club ethos of abundance and sophistication. Prime rib with Au Jus was crucial. This is the entree you'll find at every supper club across the Midwest, and it's been the signature dish since supper clubs became institutions in the 1940s. Prime rib wasn't made to order. Massive rib roasts were slow roasted all day, started in the morning so they'd be ready for dinner service. The roasts were huge, sometimes 20 to 25 pounds, bone-in standing rib roasts that required special ovens and years of experience to cook properly. They were seasoned simply, coarse salt, black pepper, maybe garlic, nothing that would interfere with the beef's natural flavor. The roasting was low and slow, around 250 to 270 degrees Fahrenheit for hours until the internal temperature hit medium rare. The outside developed a dark, crusty bark while the interior stayed pink and juicy. When you ordered prime rib, you specified your cut, end cut with more crust, or center cut that was more uniformly pink. The size varied, a queen cut for smaller appetites, a king cut for serious eaters, and sometimes a duchess cut for those who wanted just a taste. The carving happened at a carving station, the meat still in the oven to stay warm, or sometimes tableside if the club was particularly fancy. The beef was sliced thick, at least an inch, showing that gradient from crusty exterior to pink center. The Au Jus was crucial, the drippings from the roast pan, deglazed with beef stock or red wine, strained and kept warm in a gravy boat. Real Au Jus was thin, not thickened like gravy, just pure beef essence. The meat was served on a hot plate with the Au Jus in a small cup alongside or pooled on the plate. Horseradish sauce was standard, prepared horseradish mixed with sour cream or whipped cream, the heat cutting through the beef's richness. Each bite was tender, beefy, and rich with fat that melted on your tongue. The Au Jus added moisture and intensified the beef flavor. The crust provided salt and texture contrast. This was the meal people came for, the reason supper clubs existed. Perfectly cooked beef, simple preparation, generous portions, and the ritual of ordering your cut and doneness level.